Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to be reading from this really cool book called Pride, an inspirational history of the LGBTQ plus movement. It is Pride Month after all. I've got my nails on and I had some requests to do a Pride video this year. If I remember, I'll pop them up on screen. But also may as well take this opportunity to tell you all that I am bisexual. To me, it's like the sky is blue. Like, it's like no big. I've known it for well over 10 years now. So if you didn't know, now you know. Happy Pride, everyone. Let's get into it because this is going to be a long one. Pride. Inspirational history. So yeah, out of this book, there's a lot of different sections. We're just going to read the history sections, starting with clues from the past. Words such as homosexual, bisexual, and transgender are relatively recent terms, but that doesn't mean that they describe anything new. LGBTQ plus people have existed throughout the ages, playing their part and making their mark in the world. There's evidence of same-sex love in almost all ancient civilizations. The celebrated Greek conqueror Alexander the Great is widely believed to have been bisexual. The Roman Emperor Hadrian was so distraught when his male companion Antinous drowned that he named an Egyptian city Antinopolis in his memory. Sappho, who is considered the greatest female poet of the ancient world, wrote about her attraction to younger women. The word lesbian comes from the Greek island of Lesbos, where Sappho was born. LGBTQ plus themes also appear in myths. The ancient Greek god Zeus was so besotted with the Trojan prince Ganymede that he chose him to serve as his cup-bearer on Mount Olympus, and he placed him amongst the stars as the constellation Aquarius. In India, ancient Hindu texts tell of gods and goddesses changing their gender and of same-sex encounters. In one Chinese myth, Emperor Ai from the Han Dynasty cut off the sleeve of his robe so he wouldn't disturb his male lover Dongshan, who had fallen asleep on it. According to Japanese folklore, male same-sex love was introduced into the worlds by the gods Shinu no Hafuri and Ama no Hafuri. One of the reasons why historians know that LGBTQ plus people existed in the past is because of the harsh laws and punishments that were put in place to persecute them. In 13th and 14th century Europe, intolerance of homosexuality rose sharply, and laws are introduced to make it a crime. The reason for this are complex and involve both political beliefs and religious teachings. In England, the 1533 Buggery Act defined sodomy as an unnatural sexual act against the will of God and man. The punishment was death by hanging. In Britain and the US, sexual acts between women were never specifically targeted by legislation, although that didn't mean lesbianism was considered socially acceptable. Of course, laws didn't stop LGBTQ plus people from feeling the way they did, but the lack of tolerance for same-sex love and a fear of its consequences meant that all too often they either denied their natures or led secret lives tainted by shame and fear. Some historians believe that iconic figures such as Leonardo da Vinci or William Shakespeare were possibly gay or bisexual. Da Vinci was charged with sodomy in 1478, though the charge was dropped. Many of Shakespeare's sonnets, including the famous "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day," were addressed to a male character known as the fair youth. The subject is hotly debated, and scholars must weigh up the evidence to draw their own conclusions. Beneath the radar. The 18th and 19th centuries were a time of great risk for LGBTQ plus people. but also of increased opportunity. As people moved from rural communities to the expanding cities, there were more chances for LGBTQ plus people to meet each other, though social disapproval and the fear of punishment forced them underground. In 1791, during the French Revolution, France removed homosexuality from its penal code, meaning it was no longer illegal between consenting adults. The Napoleonic Code of 1804 extended the law to those countries occupied by France, including the Netherlands and some Western German regions, though in Germany homosexuality was later recriminalized. This was an early step for gay rights, though discrimination remained. In 19th century America, some free thinkers began to shake things up. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau were philosophers and writers who stressed the importance of individual freedom and railed against conformity. Both wrote about same-sex desire, though there is no evidence that either man was gay. Walt Whitman, one of America's best-loved poets, is widely believed to have been gay or bisexual. He never actually came out or had an openly gay relationship, but his poetry contains passages that clearly celebrate male love. For this reason, some argue that Whitman is one of the earliest voices of the gay liberation movement. Another much-loved poet of 19th century America is Emily Dickinson. The ambiguous style and imagery of her striking poetry has led to speculation that she was a lesbian, a theory given weight by the passionate letters she wrote to her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. One such letter reads, "Now farewell, Susie. I had a kiss, shyly, lest there's somebody there. Don't let them see, will you, Susie?" People have long been fascinated with the idea of Dickinson as an old-fashioned spinster who shut herself away from society, but it's quite possible that, like so many others of her time, she was forced to suppress who she really was. In 1861, the death penalty for homosexuality was removed from the British Penal Code. However, the Criminal Law Amendment of 1885 made any kind of homosexual act between men a crime under the term gross indecency. The vagueness around the law meant that men were easily blackmailed, and it soon became known as the Blackmailers' Charter. Oscar Wilde famously fell victim to it 10 years later. In response to this kind of persecution, the 19th century saw the birth of the first gay activism. Karl Heinrich Ulrichs was a German writer who was seen as a gay rights pioneer. In 1854, he resigned from his job as a lawyer after his homosexuality was discovered. Ulrichs called himself an Urning, believing he had a female soul trapped inside a male body. He argued that this was something that people were born with, and therefore couldn't be wicked. In 1867, Ulrichs bravely stood up at the Congress of German Jurists in Munich to call for a repeal of all anti-homosexual laws. A few years later, he wrote, "The Urning, too, is a person. He, too, therefore, has inalienable rights. Legislatures have no right to veto nature." I'm not going to read all the little boxes, but I do have to read this one because this guy comes up in the next chapter with no explanation. So it says, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, founded in Germany in 1897, is thought to be the world's earliest LGBTQ plus rights organization. It was set up by Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jewish doctor who realized that many of his LGBTQ plus patients had poor mental health because of the way they were treated by society. Arguing that sexuality was something people were born with and not a choice, he fought for social acceptance and to overturn Germany's anti-gay laws. The committee's motto was Per Scientiam and Ad Justitiam, which means through science to justice. seeds of change. The birth of LGBTQ plus rights. Oscar Wilde's sensational trials at the close of the 19th century were widely discussed in the European and American press, bringing the issue of homosexuality out into the open. Horrified by what she described as the great injustice of Wilde's treatment was political activist Emma Goldman, a Russian immigrant living in New York City. She spoke publicly in favor of LGBTQ plus rights. As we've already seen, Magnus Hirschfeld was making determined efforts in Germany to educate the public on LGBTQ plus issues, which had resulted in the relaxing of anti-gay laws following the First World War. In 1919, he opened the Institute for Sexual Research, and the World League for Sexual Reform was founded in 1928. Hirschfeld toured Europe, speaking to huge crowds, and later he went to the US and Asia. Someone who was greatly influenced by German reforms was Henry Gerber, a soldier who had served in the US Army in Berlin after the First World War. Gerber hoped for the same progress in the US. In 1924, he founded America's first gay rights organization called the Society for Human Rights. The society issued a publication called Friendship and Freedom, but it only lasted 2 issues. In 1925, police raided Gerber's home and he was jailed. The charges were eventually dropped, but Gerber lost his post office job for conduct unbecoming a postal worker. In France, homosexuality had been decriminalized in 1791. This allowed LGBTQ plus culture to flourish, but mostly still underground. In the early 20th century, Paris became known as the Bohemian capital of Europe, attracting writers and artists from around the world, many of them LGBTQ plus. One such writer was the American playwright and poet Natalie Clifford Barney. She published her first book of poems in 1900. Some portrait sonnets of women with openly lesbian themes. Barney's salons, gatherings where artists could discuss their work, drew famous writers like T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Colette. Firmly opposed to monogamy, Barney had a string of lesbian relationships, including with Dolly Wilde, the niece of Oscar Wilde. In the U.S., prohibition came into force in 1920. However, the result was the opposite of what the authorities had intended. It got the party started. All sorts of people were thrown together as they sought out places where they could get a drink. Illegal bars called speakeasies thrived, and so did gay culture, especially in New York. Masquerade balls or drag balls had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s they became part of a highly visible LGBTQ plus scene. A backlash was on its way, though, and the brief freedoms of the Roaring Twenties would soon fall away. It would be a long time before LGBTQ plus culture would be allowed to raise its head so publicly again. The backlash. The crash of the U.S. stock market in 1929 triggered the Great Depression and in turn led to a crackdown on immoral behavior. During this period, many people were out of work, and there was a belief that perhaps the liberal values of the Roaring Twenties had allowed this financial catastrophe to happen. In the U.S., Prohibition ended in 1933, and along with it, the speakeasies that had helped gay culture to thrive. Female impersonators were barred from pansy clubs, and in London, too, there was a clampdown. In one private drag ball organized by Lady Austen in 1933, 60 men were arrested in a police raid, and 27 of them were given jail sentences. The Hays Code was a list of rules introduced to the U.S. film industry in 1930 to shape and stifle filmmaking. Films were to be moral and to encourage correct thinking. As a result, nudity, swearing, and homosexuality were all banned. LGBTQ plus stars were forced to keep their sexuality under wraps. Some were even pressured to enter lavender marriages to give audiences the appearance of a wholesome home life. Rumors swirled around Hollywood for years that stars such as Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, and Randolph Scott all had same-sex relationships. It is said that Tallulah Bankhead and Billie Holiday dated, but given the atmospheres of secrecy at the time, we will never know for sure. Like New York, Berlin had a thriving LGBTQ plus culture in the 1920s. There were many gay and lesbian bars and cafes, and open displays of gay nightlife. Of course, these developments didn't mean that the discrimination and persecution of the LGBTQ plus community had disappeared, but they did seem to signal that things might be changing. However, as the Depression spread economic anxiety, Europe's fascist parties preached against a tolerance of undesirable people and minorities. The leader of Germany's Nazi Party, Adolf Hitler, saw homosexuality as a threat to his ideal of a pure race, especially since male partnerships could not bear children. In May 1933, he banned gay organizations. The Institute for Sexual Research, opened by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1919, was called Un-German, and its archives and library of 20,000 books were raided and burned as part of the huge organized Nazi book burnings. Hirschfeld was violently assaulted on several occasions, but he managed to escape the Nazi terror, and he died in Paris in 1935. In 1934, the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, opened an anti-gay division to hunt down LGBTQ plus people, particularly gay men. In 1935 alone, 8,500 were arrested. The anti-gay laws that had been relaxed as a result of Hirschfeld's efforts were now tightened and made more punishing. As the Nazi grip on Europe expanded, so too did the wave of anti-gay fanaticism. LGBTQ plus people hauled in for questioning were pressured to name others. Many gay men were sent to prison, while up to 15,000 were sent to concentration camps. It is impossible to know how many LGBTQ plus people perished in Germany's death camps, but what is well known is that they were often singled out for particular cruelty. Turning points. Shaking things up. Despite the horrors of Nazi oppression, the Second World War offered LGBTQ plus people opportunities to meet like-minded individuals and to discover and even embrace who they were. Millions of men and women were thrown together in all-male or all-female environments, far away from the watchful eyes of judgmental family or neighbors. In this atmosphere, LGBTQ plus connections flourished more easily. Although homosexuality was still illegal in most countries, the authorities were more likely to overlook it because their focus was on the war effort. The war also turned gender roles upside down. With so many men away at war, women were permitted to take on roles traditionally filled by men, and in doing so they discovered a new sense of independence. In recruitment posters, women were shown looking strong and competent. And with men away from home, women relied more on each other for support, so sexual relationships were more likely to thrive. After the war ended in 1945, life returned to normal in many ways. Men went back to their civilian jobs, women became housewives once again, and the witch hunts for LGBTQ plus people resumed. But something had changed. The sheer horror of the war had forced many people to think about society in a new way, that there is a desire for a kinder, more tolerant world. Many of those who had found same-sex love were unwilling to return to their old lives, and they would play a part in the new organizations that were emerging. After the Second World War, the LGBTQ plus cultures that had been silenced in Nazi Europe stirred again. Many new groups were founded in the late 1940s, like Denmark's Forbundet 1948 and the COC in the Netherlands, which is now the oldest active LGBTQ plus organization in the world. The word homophile came into use as an alternative to homosexual, placing the emphasis on love rather than sex, and the groups that formed during this period became known as the homophile movement. Meanwhile, in the U.S., two groundbreaking books by zoologist and biologist Dr. Alfred Kinsey were published: Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female claimed that far more people were gay, lesbian, or bisexual than anyone had ever suspected. The idea that 10% of the male population and up to 3% of women were mostly or completely homosexual caused public outrage, but the Kinsey reports did have a positive impact on how some people thought about same-sex relationships. Despite Kinsey's work, however, the so-called Lavender Scare was at work in 1950s America. The Cold War encouraged fear and suspicion. The Red Scare meant that anyone labeled as a communist sympathizer was rooted out of government. In the same way, many LGBTQ plus people also lost their government posts and were prohibited from holding professional jobs. In 1950, in this atmosphere of hatred and persecution, activist Harry Hay set up the Mattachine Society, a support group for gay and bisexual men. A few years later, lesbian couple Phyllis Lyon and Del Martin, who in 2008 would become one of the first same-sex couples to legally marry in California, set up the Daughters of Bilitis, a secret society for lesbians and bisexual women. The name was based on the 19th century collection of lesbian poetry, the Songs of Bilitis, so the society could pass as a poetry club. In 1956, it published the first issue of The Ladder, America's first lesbian newspaper. These days, it's hard for us to imagine how repressive the atmosphere was for the LGBTQ plus community in the 1950s. Laws varied from country to country, but even in places where homosexuality was legal, LGBTQ plus people felt the heavy burden of moral and social disapproval. Homosexuality was never a crime under Polish law, and it was decriminalized in Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland, and Sweden, but that did not make life easy for LGBTQ plus people. Britain followed the US, clamping down on LGBTQ plus offenses and attempting to rid the government of homosexual influences. Undercover police officers posed as gay men in order to ensnare offenders, and in the early 1950s, up to 1,000 men were jailed each year. In 1953, the great British actor and theater director Sir John Gielgud was caught out by such a trap, and the details were splashed across the newspapers. Although Gielgud was only fined and not imprisoned, the experience led him to suffer a nervous breakdown a few months later. In this sinister atmosphere of witch hunts, the British government feared that gay civil servants could easily be blackmailed into giving away state secrets. As a result, the Wolfenden Committee, led by Sir John Wolfenden, was set up to consider whether the law should be changed. The birth of pride. Fighting back. The 1960s were a time of great political and social change in the Western world. Young people began to question authority and rebel against the social conformity of the 1950s. There was a desire for more freedom and for more rights, both for women and for minority groups. In the U.S., the struggle for civil rights for African Americans gathered real momentum, and protests against the Vietnam War became a force of resistance. For the LGBTQ+ community, the 1960s saw progress as well as setbacks. Hungary decriminalized homosexuality in 1961, while Illinois became the first state in the U.S. to do so in 1962. In the UK, although the Sexual Offences Act of 1967 was a step in the right direction, making homosexuality legal for men aged over 21 in England and Wales, it didn't fully decriminalize sexual acts between men. Furthermore, the Roman Catholic Church stated in 1961 that those affected by the perverse inclination of homosexuality should not be permitted to take religious vows or be ordained. It was clear that society continued to regard LGBTQ+ people with contempt, and that decriminalization didn't mean instant change. In 1966, 3 years before the Stonewall riots, the Mattachine Society staged a small but important protest. At the time, many New York bars refused to serve gay people because of a regulation introduced by the state liquor authority, which flagged homosexual patrons as being potentially disorderly. On April 21st, 3 Mattachine members, accompanied by news reporters, entered a popular bar. They explained to the bartender that they were gay before ordering drinks and waiting to be refused service. The story hit the newspapers, shining a light on the routine harassment suffered by LGBTQ+ people. The protest became known as the Sip-In and led to the New York City Commission on Human Rights declaring that gay people had a right to be served. This small act of resistance showed that change was possible. The stage had been set for a greater protest. The Stonewall Inn was a bar in New York's Greenwich Village where gay men, lesbians, transgender people, and drag queens could relax and openly express themselves. At the time, it was very difficult for the LGBTQ+ community to do this. Remember that even a man holding another man's hand in public could result in a prison sentence. The New York police regularly raided gay bars looking for reasons to close them down. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, they raided the Stonewall Inn. The same thing that happened just 3 days earlier, and people were fed up with accepting this constant harassment. As usual, the police roughly pushed customers around and demanded to see their IDs. But things didn't go as planned for the police that night, and events quickly got out of hand. As handcuffed customers were shoved outside and bundled into vans, a growing crowd began to throw objects at the police. Accounts vary as to what part the different members of the LGBTQ+ community played, but some say that when a black lesbian called Stormé de Laverie was thrown into a van, she yelled at bystanders to do something. Anger quickly spread and the crowd violently erupted. Police vans were rocked, tires were slashed, and bottles and rocks were thrown at the police, who ended up barricading themselves into the Stonewall Inn. The police were rescued by reinforcements that night, but it was not the end of the Stonewall uprising. For 6 more days and nights, people took to the streets in protest against police oppression and brutality. There is no turning back now. The LGBTQ+ community demanded equality. There's Marsha P. Johnson. Say it loud. The Stonewall riots made one thing clear: nothing could be changed without action, and LGBTQ+ activists would need to become more organized, more visible, and a lot louder. In the years immediately following the riots, there was a sense of hope as a global movement took shape. Immediately after the riots, the Gay Liberation Front, or GLF, was formed in the U.S., calling for the sexual liberation of all people. It published a newspaper called Come Out and organized meetings and demonstrations. A British branch of the GLF was formed in late 1970. It staged gay days, festivals, and protests, and attracted high-profile media attention. Although the GLF later splintered into other groups, it set the agenda for what was needed: confrontation and direct action. Before 1970, few LGBTQ+ people had the courage to come out openly or to campaign publicly. They feared being disowned by their families, losing their jobs, or being arrested. Now there was a call to find strength in numbers, to be unafraid, and to take to the streets. Brenda Howard, a bisexual activist, was heavily involved in organizing New York's first LGBTQ+ Liberation March in 1970. The slogan Pride was coined, and Howard became known as the Mother of Pride. The idea quickly spread around the world. London held its first Pride March in 1972, Italy in 1978, and Germany and Spain in 1979. In Sydney, Australia, a parade was held in honor of the Stonewall riots in June 1978, but it was violently halted by the police, who arrested many participants. As a result of this ugly episode, Australia relaxed its anti-LGBTQ+ laws. Since 1980, a huge Mardi Gras street party has been held in Sydney, and it's now one of the biggest and most colorful prides in the world. Thousands of Pride events now take place around the world each year. Pride, the opposite of shame, affirms the right of LGBTQ+ people to have equality and visibility and to be treated with dignity. These days, prides are rarely controversial in the Western world, but that is certainly not the case in many countries. In recent years, tear gas and rubber bullets have been used against marchers in Istanbul, Turkey. In Russia, Moscow Pride began in 2006, but marches there have consistently been marred by violent attacks. In 2012, the Moscow courts banned Pride marches for the next 100 years. It's Harvey Milk, one of my heroes. Disaster strikes. Fear and loathing. For decades, LGBTQ+ people had been forced to endure society's misguided belief that homosexuality was an illness. But in the early 1980s, a real disease hit the community hard. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, is a virus that attacks the body's immune system, making it less able to fight off infections. AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, is the most advanced stage of HIV infection. Although there is no cure for HIV, people diagnosed with the condition today can take medication that allows them to lead healthy lives. However, in the 1980s and for most of the 1990s, HIV was almost always a death sentence. Anyone can get HIV, but when it first arrived in westernized countries, it spread fastest among gay men. Most commonly, it's transmitted through unprotected sex or by sharing drug injection needles. It cannot be transmitted through casual contact, such as kissing or sharing eating utensils. Researchers believe that HIV originated in Central Africa around 1920. It's not certain when the virus first entered the U.S., but in 1981, there were several reports of previously healthy gay men mysteriously falling ill with rare infections. By the end of that year, there had been well over 100 deaths in the U.S. An unease rapidly spread. The disease began to show itself around the world. As unease spread. Terence Higgins was one of the first British people to die of the condition. After his death in July 1982, his family and friends set up the Terence Higgins Trust, a charity that has been at the forefront of fighting HIV/AIDS ever since. By 1984, scientists had worked out the cause of AIDS. Although the virus can infect anybody, fear and suspicion meant that the LGBTQ plus community was isolated and victimized. Around the world, news headlines like "Gay Plague Brings Havoc" only stoked this prejudice. By 1987, there were 40,000 people with HIV in the U.S., but the administration was slow to act. President Reagan didn't publicly speak about AIDS until 1987, and funding for research was woefully inadequate. This was partly due to the perception that AIDS was a gay problem. Meanwhile, celebrity deaths around the world continued to draw attention to the devastating impact of AIDS. They included French philosopher Michel Foucault, American supermodel Gia Karangi, American pianist Liberace, British rock star Freddie Mercury, Russian ballet dancer Rudolf Nureyev, American tennis player Arthur Ashe, and Australian designer Lee Bowery. In 1987, Princess Diana did much to challenge attitudes when she shook hands with a man dying from AIDS. Since it was still widely believed that just touching someone with the virus was risky, Princess Diana's simple gesture had a powerful impact. Meanwhile, American activist Larry Kramer co-founded a direct action group called ACT UP in 1987. Its mission was to stage ambitious protests that would force government agencies and drug companies to take action. ACT UP became an international force with a particularly strong presence in Paris. French activists staged die-ins and threw fake blood at medical researchers. The epidemic could no longer be ignored, but it was not until 1996 that an effective treatment for HIV became available. By then, 6.4 million people had died, and more than 22 million were estimated to be living with the virus. The AIDS crisis ripped through the heart of the gay community. So many died, and those left behind were traumatized and fearful for their own health. Added to this, people had to put up with a renewed wave of homophobia. But AIDS also brought different parts of the LGBTQ plus population together. Many lesbians played a crucial role by starting food banks and caring for the sick. United by tragedy, the LGBTQ plus community emerged as a strong political force. Out of the shadows. Setbacks and gains. AIDS not only devastated the gay community, it also fueled a vicious backlash. Homophobic messages spread by right-wing groups and a hostile media had a disastrous effect on public opinion. For example, I'm not going to read Jerry Falwell. Forget that. In Great Britain, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government passed a law in 1988 known as Section 28. The first homophobic British law in more than 100 years, it had a devastating impact on young LGBTQ+ people for years to come. Section 28 stated that local government could not intentionally promote homosexuality. This meant that teachers felt unable to even mention LGBTQ+ issues or tackle homophobic bullying. Libraries could not stock material with gay or lesbian themes, and there was no proper funding for LGBTQ+ support services for young people. Campaigners reacted furiously. Lesbian activists repelled into the House of Lords chamber from a viewing gallery, while a BBC News broadcast was disrupted by 4 lesbians handcuffing themselves to a TV camera. More than 20,000 protesters marched in Manchester, and actor Sir Ian McKellen came out as gay in order to voice his fury. Section 28 jolted the LGBTQ plus movement into real fighting mode. Groups like Stonewall and Outrage were founded, while Schools Out UK worked tirelessly to keep LGBTQ plus issues visible. Section 28 was finally removed from law in 2003, but its cruel legacy was far-reaching. Many LGBTQ plus children who grew up in its shadow were victimized, bullied, and forced to suffer in silence in schools that could offer neither support nor understanding. LGBTQ plus rights in Britain and the US appeared to take a backward step in the 1980s. There was some positive news elsewhere. In 1989, Denmark became the first country to pass a law allowing same-sex unions, calling them registered partnerships. Norway and Sweden followed suit in 1993 and 1995, respectively. In 1996, South Africa became the first country in the world to introduce equal rights for gay and lesbian people into its constitution. This meant that discrimination on the basis of race, gender, or sexual orientation was unlawful. Sadly, this did not stamp out discrimination in South Africa. Hate crime, particularly against lesbian women, is still a big problem in rural areas. There was a steep rise in hate crimes directed against the community as LGBTQ plus issues became more visible and politicized. In Britain, a series of unsolved murders of gay men included the savage killing of actor Michael Booth in 1990. At the end of the decade, a nail bomb attack at the Admiral Duncan, a gay pub in London, killed 3 and injured 79. One result of the bombing was that the London police started to work with an independent LGBTQ plus advisory group. Brandon Teena, a young American transgender man, was brutally R-worded and life ended in 1993 by former friends after they discovered his biological sex. Teena's tragic story was retold in the acclaimed film Boys Don't Cry, drawing much-needed attention to how trans people are particularly vulnerable to hate crime. However, it was the horrific murder of American student Matthew Shepard that truly woke the world up to the reality of homophobic hate crime. If any good could come out of such a senseless and barbaric act, it was the realization that society could no longer silently tolerate such bigotry and hatred. Following the Stonewall riots in 1969, many LGBTQ plus movers and shakers shaped popular culture. While some remained closeted, other brave trailblazers chose to come out or were hiding in plain sight. In 1970, legendary British singer Dusty Springfield courageously announced her bisexuality in a magazine interview. 2 years later, David Bowie, my hero, told a music journalist he was gay, although he later said he had in fact been a closet heterosexual. His gender-bending performances sent a message that gayness was something cool rather than shameful. Although both Springfield and Bowie saw their music sales affected, they projected an otherness that countless LGBTQ plus people could relate to. They paved the way for other LGBTQ plus artists to come out, such as Elton John in 1976. Meanwhile, Queen's flamboyant lead singer Freddie Mercury was never afraid to flaunt his sexuality, but neither did he ever align himself with the LGBTQ plus movement. For Mercury, who died of AIDS in 1991, his attitude to his sexuality seems to have been, so what? And many would say that is a statement in itself. As the AIDS crisis hit hard in the 1980s, LGBTQ plus artists became more cautious about explicitly stating their sexual identity. The gender-fluid frontman of Culture Club, Boy George, gave various answers when asked if he was gay. George Michael, of the 1980s pop duo Wham! And later a solo star, promoted a heterosexual image, until he was publicly outed in 1998. However, some, like Jimmy Somerville of Bronski Beat, were out loud and proud. His group's 1984 hit Small Town Boy spoke of the anguish that young LGBTQ+ people often face. By the 1990s, homophobia was still widespread, but more and more people in the public eye were choosing to come out. Pop icon Madonna opened up LGBTQ+ culture to the mainstream, with her video showing gay dancers and same-sex kissing. Meanwhile, Canadian country star Katie Lang came out as a lesbian in 1992, increasing visibility for lesbian women. In 1998, the triumph of Israeli singer Dana International at the Eurovision Song Contest was a landmark movement for the visibility of the transgender community. Toward equality. The road toward marriage equality has been a long and difficult one. Opponents argue that marriage is a union between a man and a woman. Some of those with religious or moral objections to same-sex relationships argue that granting equal rights to same-sex couples turns a moral wrong into a civil right or represents a danger to the traditional family structure. Not all LGBTQ+ people agree that equal marriage is an important right either. Some believe that copying a heterosexual tradition reinforces the idea that straight relationships are the norm. Some lesbians oppose marriage on feminist grounds because it has traditionally benefited men. But for many LGBTQ+ people, marriage is an important civil right. A lack of equality in the eyes of the law sends the message that LGBTQ+ lives matter less and that their relationships are less valid. In short, it's discrimination. The fight for legal recognition for same-sex marriage may seem like a 21st century battle, but the first small steps toward marriage equality were taken much earlier. In the years following the Stonewall riots, many same-sex couples applied for marriage licenses, though it was not until the 1990s that the push for equal marriage rights began to gather pace. As small gains were made, opponents panicked and there was a backlash. In 1996, American President Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as the union between one man and one woman. This effectively denied same-sex couples the federal benefits, such as inheritance rights, that married heterosexual couples enjoyed. The act remained in place until 2013. In 2001, the Netherlands became the first country in the world to make it possible for same-sex couples to marry. The legislation also gave them the right to adopt children. 4 same-sex couples were married in Amsterdam on the day the law came into effect. Over the next few years, other countries followed suit, including Belgium, Canada, Spain, and South Africa. As of 2019, 29 countries have made same-sex marriage legal. In Britain, civil partnerships were introduced in 2004, giving same-sex couples the same rights as married couples, but not the label of marriage. Equal marriage was introduced in 2014, though not in Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, the Republic of Ireland became the first country in 2015 to legalize same-sex marriage after a popular vote. In the U.S. in 2000, Vermont was the first state to make civil partnerships legal, while in 2004, Massachusetts became the first to allow same-sex marriage. By the start of 2015, same-sex marriage was still illegal in 13 states, but in June of that year it was finally legalized across the nation. In 2013, New Zealand became the first country in the Asia-Pacific region to allow same-sex marriage, while Australia decisively voted for it in 2017. For Penny Wong, Australia's first openly gay senator, the result was both a political victory and a moment of personal joy. In a moving speech, she said, "Equality never comes easy. It was true of women fighting for suffrage. It is true of Australia's first peoples, who have fought to be truly recognized as citizens of our nation. And it has been true for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex Australians fighting for equality before the law. Traditionally, society has understood a family to mean one man, one woman, and their children. And whether married or not, same-sex couples have often struggled to build a family life. As marriage equality has gradually become a reality in parts of the world, many legal barriers have fallen away. Most European countries now allow same-sex couples to adopt children, and this right was granted in the US in 2017 and in Australia in 2018. However, despite changes to the law, LGBTQ plus families still encounter prejudice and discrimination in their everyday lives. Given the long fight for LGBTQ plus rights, it is not surprising that the world has struggled to accept the idea of an LGBTQ plus person holding political power. However, the last 2 decades have seen a number of firsts. In 2009, Iceland's Jóhanna Sigurðardóttir made history when she became the first openly LGBTQ plus person to become a country's prime minister. Elio Di Rupo became Prime Minister of Belgium in 2011, and Xavier Bettel was elected Luxembourg's Prime Minister in 2013. In Serbia, Ana Brnabić was elected leader in 2017, while Leo Varadkar became Ireland's Prime Minister in the same year. The road to LGBTQ plus people participating in public life has been a long one, with many pioneers along the way. In 1974, lesbian Kathy Kozachenko was the first openly LGBTQ plus person to successfully run for public office in the U.S., while Dutch names, Koos Huysen, the Netherlands, was the first openly gay person to become a member of parliament in 1976. Others bravely followed. Italy's first openly gay MP was Angelo Pezzana in 1979. In Britain, Chris Smith became the country's first MP to voluntarily come out in 1984, while Wahid Ali was the first openly gay man to enter the House of Lords. In 1988, Canada's first openly gay MP was Svend Robinson, while Bob Brown became Australia's first out MP in 1996. In 2019, Taiga Ishikawa became the first openly gay person to be elected to Japan's national parliament. Transgender politicians have been described as the Cinderellas of the LGBTQ plus community because of their struggle for visibility. In 1991, Joanne Marie Conte became the first trans woman to be elected to an American city council, while New Zealand's Georgina Beyer became the world's first openly trans mayor in 1995. In 2017, Tamara Adrian was the first trans person to be elected to political office in Venezuela. She has said that officials like her are creating hope for those who have been excluded. Coming out can be enormously challenging in the world of sport. Society has fixed ideas about what an elite athlete should be, and being LGBTQ+ often flies in the face of what maleness or strength are thought to look like. In the 1970s, American baseball player Glenn Burke was one of the first athletes to kick back against the status quo. Although he never publicly came out, he didn't hide his gay identity either. When the team management offered him $75,000 to get married, he refused. He retired at the age of 27 and tragically died of AIDS in 1995. In 1981, American tennis champion Billie Jean King hit the headlines when she was outed as a lesbian. Things became very difficult for her. She lost all her endorsements, worth $2 million, within 24 hours, and she was shamed and ridiculed by the media. King has since become a passionate activist for social equality. In the macho world of rugby league, Australian Ian Roberts was the first player and high-profile Australian athletes to come out. In 1995, he braved public abuse but was also hailed as an inspiring role model. Meanwhile, Welsh rugby union star Gareth Thomas says he lifted the lid on years of despair when he came out as gay in 2009. Another stigma was challenged in 2019 when he revealed he was HIV positive. The first openly gay transgender athlete to compete professionally was tennis player Renee Richards. When she was barred from the US Open, Richards filed a lawsuit, was declared legally female, and then competed in the 1977 event. Today, the issue of trans people competing in sport remains controversial, and trans athletes continue fighting for acceptance. While homophobia remains in sport, the list of stars who have come out grows ever longer. Among their number are Canadian Olympic ice hockey player Sarah Vaillancourt, transgender Thai boxing star Parinya Charompol, American ice skater Adam Rippon, amazing, Belgian tennis player Alison van Uytvanck, and Greet Minnen, partners on and off the court, British boxer Nicola Adams, American golfer Tad Fujikawa, and Israeli Paralympic basketball player Moran Samuel. With the push toward inclusion, the 21st century has seen the lives of LGBTQ+ characters increasingly represented in TV and film, and more celebrities are proudly embracing their sexual identities and actively fighting for LGBTQ+ rights. Mainstream TV shows like Orange is the New Black, Queer Eye, and Pose, and films such as Brokeback Mountain, Carol, and A Fantastic Woman have a direct impact on how we view our world. That's why it's so important that they show a diverse range of characters and feature stories that accurately reflect the society we live in. For young LGBTQ+ people particularly, who might be struggling to embrace their sexual identity, it's incredibly important to see people and stories in the media that they identify with. For example, How Gay is Pakistan? 2015 documentary made by Pakistani-British comic Mohan Rizwan explores why coming out to his parents was so difficult. It's no longer the case that identifying as LGBTQ+ is a career-ending moment. But in this modern age of social media, stars are more vulnerable than ever to homophobic abuse and personal attacks. But out and proud celebrities, such as English musician and LGBTQ activist Ollie Alexander, outspoken actor Elliot Page, and model Cara Delevingne, who brought bisexuality to the mainstream, play important roles in fighting discrimination and helping the LGBTQ+ community feel more connected and less isolated. Fight goes on. Let's read this last little bit. I think, this is the last chapter. The LGBTQ+ community today. In June 2019, jubilant LGBTQ+ rights campaigners in Africa celebrated a major victory when Botswana decriminalized homosexuality. One of the judges stated, "Human dignity is harmed when minority groups are marginalized." LGBTQ+ rights have come a long way in the past few decades, but the fight isn't over. Around the world, people face violence, torture, and even death simply for who they love and who they are. In much of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and parts of the Americas, homosexuality is still illegal. Homosexuality is legal in all European countries, but rights and protections vary widely. In Russia, for example, it's dangerous to be visibly out. In 2013, a gay propaganda law was introduced. It bans the promotion of homosexuality, which has had the effect of preventing young people from accessing information about LGBTQ+ issues. Since the law was passed, homophobic attacks have rocketed. Although LGBTQ+ people everywhere are vulnerable to discrimination and hate crime, The situation for transgender people is particularly challenging. Around the world, they frequently encounter hatred and violence. They must also battle legal obstacles in order to have their gender recognized, to access services, and to enjoy equal opportunities. Organizations such as Canadian charity Rainbow Railroad do vital work in helping LGBTQ+ people living in fear to escape to a safer country. In the past, being LGBTQ+ could be incredibly scary and lonely. And of course, that is still the case for people in many parts of the world. But LGBTQ+ people have always found a way to find and connect with each other. And since the Stonewall riots, countless community groups have thrived. Today, many gay bars, nightclubs, and other dedicated spaces offer LGBTQ+ people the chance to get together in a safe, non-judgmental environment. These spaces tend to be concentrated in urban areas, so LGBTQ+ people living in more rural areas can still feel excluded, as well as older people and those with financial restrictions or disabilities. As the deadly 2016 Pulse nightclub attack in Orlando, Florida showed, homophobia can still rear its ugly head. Nevertheless, it's vitally important that there are places where LGBTQ+ people can feel free to be themselves. Online spaces and communities also provide important ways for LGBTQ+ people to connect with each other and to explore and make sense of their identity. Of course, LGBTQ+ people can experience hate and harassment online, but the internet can also be a place of refuge for those looking to express who they are. Today, there's growing awareness that the concept of a single LGBTQ+ community is not always helpful. In the long fight for equality, LGBTQ+ people have often found strength in numbers, but it's also important to remember that within the community, there exist people with vastly different experiences and needs. For example, trans people, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people of faith, and disabled people may all experience real feelings of exclusion, even within the LGBTQ+ community. I think that is the end. There's lots more cool stuff in this book. Highly recommend. But that's all that we're going to read for tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good Pride Month. And a good